Good.
Yes. Also, members should unmute themselves when they're ready.
Virtual gavel that we have. So the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any point, and all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. To insert something in the record, please have your staff email the previously mentioned address or contact full committee staff. Please keep your video function on at all times, even when you're not recognized by the chair. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves, and please remember to mute yourself after you finish. Consistent with House Resolution 965 and accompanying regulations, staff will only mute members and witnesses as appropriate when they're not under recognition to eliminate background noise. I see that we have a quorum present. I really want to thank everyone on a Friday for doing this. It's an important issue. I'll now recognize myself for opening remarks. And pursuant to the notice, we're holding a hearing to discuss, with American lives on the line, lessons for managing the Russia threat. 2 weeks ago, the startling revelations broke that Russia put bounties on American troops serving in Afghanistan. This week, in the Foreign Affairs Committee, we've been examining this egregious attack on Americans and the Trump administration's failure to handle it appropriately. I think it's important for the public to know this. I've personally been involved in 4 hearings this week alone that have dealt with this issue, and that doesn't include the actions of other committees working on their own. So I just want to underscore to the people listening that they should know that we in Congress are taking oversight of this matter very seriously. Party politics and everything aside, the one thing, if we do nothing else, one of the most basic and most fundamental duties is to do everything in our power to keep Americans safe. We owe it to the service members whose lives were lost in Afghanistan. We owe it to their families. We owe it to every member of our military and every American serving abroad who puts their life on the line every day in service of our country. On Tuesday, the subcommittee heard from former U.S. officials and experts on the Kremlin's network for malign actors and systems of corruption that oppress the Russian people and sustain its criminal actions, and hybrid warfare. That and your submitted testimony, Secretary Panetta, you know, may be even more dangerous than the threats we faced during the Cold War. While invited, it's regrettable that Secretary Pompeo declined to participate yesterday in our full committee hearing. This is part of a pattern of failure to recognize the importance of a united and unambiguous U.S. response to the escalating threats we face from the Kremlin. The members of our committee had many questions about what happened, and with the questions of murdered service members at hand, it would have been helpful, to say the least, to hear from the Secretary himself as we reckon with the gravity of this issue. To his credit, Secretary of Defense Esper appeared before the House Armed Service Committee yesterday, and in response to my questioning, acknowledged that he had seen reports of payments in response to attacks on our troops. Today, we're honored to be joined by Secretary Leon Panetta, a dedicated public servant who shaped U.S. national security policy for decades and whose perspective and range of experience on these issues is frankly unparalleled. Having himself served in the U.S. House of Representatives, Secretary Panetta is familiar with the important role the legislative branch plays in shaping our national security trajectory. Secretary Panetta later served in multiple executive functions under 2 presidential administrations, including as Secretary of Defense, Director of the CIA, and White House Chief of Staff. We're fortunate to have you joining us today because as we try to understand what transpired in the Kremlin's bounty scheme and how much of the Trump administration knew about it or not, your experience is uniquely instructive. You're someone who's been responsible for American troops abroad, for managing a primary element of our intelligence apparatus, and for ensuring the president has access to the intelligence and resources he needs to carry out the duties of that office. Furthermore, Secretary Panetta has overseen and shaped U.S. policy towards Russia throughout the course of his career. Beyond the specific instance of Kremlin aggression against Americans abroad, the resounding takeaway from this week in all the hearings so far is we have no Russia policy. In its place, we have a misguided, ill-defined, impulsive, and frankly dangerous series of actions prioritizing the interests of the Kremlin over the dedicated efforts of our intelligence community, diplomats, and career civil servants. The sacrifices of our military and the American national security interest should, as always, remain paramount. There's been no shortage of information available to President Trump about Russia's malign activities, and yet it's been one gift to Putin after another, whether it's pulling out of the European-supported INF and Open Skies treaties, withdrawing our forces from Syria without notice to our allies who had troops on the ground, Helsinki, his intent to reduce a quarter of our troops in Germany, inviting Russia back to a reconstituted G8, pulling funds from the European Deterrence Initiative, which was meant to deter Russian aggression, or casting blame towards Ukraine when our intelligence community had proved Russia was responsible for the attack on our 2016 election. We've been hearing all week that Putin pays attention and responds to the actions taken by the United States in concert with our allies. Yet the message I hear loud and clear from President Trump is, you can do whatever you want because we won't hold you accountable. That's unacceptable. How long do we have to wait for a policy towards Russia that prioritizes above all else keeping Americans safe? That's why these hearings this week are so important and why we're so pleased to have you joining us today, Secretary Panetta. We're looking forward to hearing from you about your perspective on where we must go here as a country in our policy and posture towards Russia. You've seen successes and failures, and we're running out of time to get this right. I now yield to Ranking Member Representative Kinzinger for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Keating, for calling this hearing, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. Since the 2008 invasion of Georgia, Russia has shown not only a willingness, but an eagerness to develop, test, and deploy an advanced set of tools to undermine democracy and Western institutions around the world. While Russia and its Soviet predecessors have used foreign forces to carry out proxy wars against the West, the reports that Russian military intelligence, often referred to as the GRU, set up a bounty program for American soldiers in Afghanistan shows an emboldened Vladimir Putin. Let us remember that this is the same unit that's responsible for interfering in our elections, using chemical weapons against Russian defectors living under NATO protection, and invaded Ukraine, a NATO aspirational nation and a EU priority partner. More recently, we've seen the Russian mercenaries supporting genocide in Syria, fueling conflict in Libya, and propping up the corrupt Maduro regime. The fact that Putin is trying to harass the United States and Afghanistan should not come as a big surprise. The question remains, though, what does Putin gain from this bounty program, and why does he feel emboldened to carry it out? I believe that Putin wants the United States to fail in Afghanistan, just like his country did nearly 4 decades ago. While some of my colleagues will likely try to paint this administration as weak on Russia, I don't believe that is what is driving Putin's agenda. Lenin once said, you probe with bayonets. If you find mush, you proceed. If you find steel, you withdraw. Over the past decade, Putin has found mostly mush when probing the United States. As Congress, we must come together and be the steel that forces Putin to think again. The first step is recognizing the nature of warfare has changed. Following the fall of the Iron Curtain, many in the West believed that we would usher in an era of perpetual peace. Countries around the world, the US included, gave up on Cold War policies that made Western institutions the standard bearer in a post-Soviet world. However, the Russians adapted, learned from their mistakes, and reinvigorated their tactics to fit the 21st century. They've been operating within a gray space that is neither war nor peace. We must now change how we respond to these clear provocations. Contrary to popular belief, this administration has pushed back against Putin. Take the incident in 2018 when Wagner mercenaries and forces loyal to Assad attacked U.S. troops in Syria. Within 4 hours, hundreds of Russians and Syrians were neutralized. The Wagner group did not provoke U.S. forces ever again. Not every provocation from Russia can be met with kinetic action. In fact, on the contrary, our greatest weapon is the alliance of like-minded nations that have defended freedom since 1949. It is in our best interest to work with our allies, much like we did throughout the Cold War, to develop and implement a strategy to counter Putin's malign activity. Much like Putin did over the past decade, we need to dust off the old Cold War playbook to confront the Russian threat. The good news is that despite all of Putin's foreign operations, he has not benefited domestically. Nearly 50% of Russians opposed waiving presidential term limits for Putin. Nearly 60% believe the president shouldn't be as old as Putin is, and only 25% of the Russian people trust Putin's plan for their country. If this does not demonstrate that Putin's strategy failed, I don't know what does. Again, I want to thank Secretary Panetta for joining us today. We'll have plenty to talk about, and with that, I'll yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Kinzinger. I now introduce our witness. And again, thank you for being here again today. Secretary Leon E. Panetta is chairman of the Panetta Institute for Public Policy. His distinguished career, as I mentioned before, in public service includes serving as the 23rd United States Secretary of Defense, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, White House Chief of Staff to President Bill Clinton, director of Office and Management of the Budget as a member, and most importantly, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from California. I'll now recognize the witness for 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the record. You're now recognized for your opening statement. And I don't know if you're muted or not, Secretary.
How's that? Can you hear me now?
You're on.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would like to submit my testimony for the record, and if I could, try to summarize it for your benefit. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be able to testify about the significant threat that all of you recognize from Russia and the threat that Russia poses to our troops and our democracy and our nation. I had the honor to serve in the House for 16 years, from 1977 through 1993. It was the height of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Through the end of the Vietnam era, the Reagan buildup, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I have to tell you, during that time, Congress played an enormously important role in conducting oversight, whether it was a Republican administration or Democratic administration, to ensure that our national security interests were protected during that Cold War. I want to commend all of you, Mr. Chairman, and all of your members for your continuing critical oversight to make sure that we protect our country. Let me begin by making clear that there's little question that we are in a new chapter of the Cold War with Russia. But this new chapter with Vladimir Putin's Russian Federation is in some ways more dangerous than what we faced with the old Soviet Union. With the Soviet Union, we were in rough parity with our nuclear capabilities. They knew our strength, we knew their strength, and in some ways that gave us leverage to be able to deal with them from a position of strength. To deal with Vladimir Putin, you have to deal with him from a position of strength. If he senses weakness on the part of the United States, then make no mistake, he will take advantage of it because he knows he doesn't have to pay a price. And thus, we've seen him take advantage of it through his aggression in Crimea, in the Ukraine, in Syria, in the US election process, in Libya, in Afghanistan, and other places. The point is very clear, and I think it's clear to all of you, that if we fail to draw lines on Putin, if we don't make clear where those lines are and make clear that he will not be allowed to cross those lines, then he will continue to be encouraged to be aggressive principal point is this. In this new Cold War chapter, what's required is a resolute, clear-eyed, strong, unambiguous leadership from the president and the rest of our government that is informed by our diplomatic, military, and intelligence professionals and guided by the need to protect our national security interests. That has got to be the message that Putin hears. Some of you may remember President Bush once said that he looked into Putin's eyes and saw somebody that he thought he would be able to deal with. My friend and former colleague Bob Gates said that he too looked into Putin's eyes and saw KGB, KGB, KGB. Putin believes that the glory of the former Soviet state must be restored. He believes the fall of the Iron Curtain brought with it an era of weakness in Russia. And he's determined to return Russia to the status of a global superpower. And the key to that strategy is to undermine the United States and to weaken our country and weaken our foreign policy. Look, Putin has his own problems. The Russian population is aging, it's shrinking. The economy of Russia is struggling. There's a mix of an overburdened socialist state with a very corrupt core of oligarchs who have literally stolen billions of dollars from the Russian people. They have serious social and economic issues. No democracy would tolerate kind of mismanagement and corruption that we've seen there. And that's why Putin has done away with any semblance of democracy. He's pushed through constitutional referendums, as we know just recently, that allows him to be a virtual dictator through 2036. Russia's strategy to restoring its superpower status is dependent on the following elements. First, they clearly want to undermine NATO and its key missions. NATO has been a barrier to the ability of Russia to expand back to the Soviet state. Secondly, they want to undermine US military presence in Europe. That presence, our forces in Europe, have been a check on Russian ambitions. Thirdly, he wants to reinsert the Russian regime back into the G7 to be able to regain the status that they lost when they were kicked out because of their invasion of the Crimea. Fourthly, they believe that interfering in the United States and other Western elections has sown chaos and discord, and they are seeking an election result in all areas that are favorable to Russia. And lastly, they have developed and in some ways perfected hybrid warfare. Russia cannot match the US in a force-on-force conflict, but they have developed asymmetric power, hybrid power. They've used a mix of civilian military capabilities to undertake deniable, lethal, covert operations. They've engaged, obviously, in election interference, the recruitment of spies and agents, the theft of technology. They've taken prisoners, all to gain geostrategic leverage while triggering without triggering conventional conflict with the West. What we saw with the latest intelligence of the possibility that Russians were using bounties in many ways comes right out of Putin's playbook. I've not read the intelligence assessment, but I think we all need to take these reports very seriously because, as I said, it fits Putin's playbook. The playbook that he's used as a result of his concerns in Afghanistan and other areas. He still resents what the United States did in Charlie Wilson's war when we kicked the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan in the 80s. He believes we have used the Afghan war as a pretext to position U.S. military and intelligence assets on the doorstep of Russia. And he resents the fact that the Afghan war has been a NATO mission. His goal is to fracture NATO. And their sense is the best way to fracture NATO is to bring them down in Afghanistan, which is the graveyard of empires. He pays mercenary forces to come after us, and that's very consistent with Putin's methods. They developed the Wagner Group to attack our forces in Syria, take over oil facilities in Libya. They've conducted assassination attempts in the UK against former spies. And obviously, they've conducted this bold attack in our own democracy in the 2016 election. The assessment is very clear. There's no question here that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in the 2016 election aimed at trying to influence what happened in the US presidential election. And they further assessed, and this is something we've just got to continue to remind ourselves, that Putin is going to apply the same lessons in the current election in this country, as well as in elections that are taking place with our US allies. This is not a hoax, it's a real threat, it works, and you can look at the consequences. It strained relations between the United States and NATO allies. There was even the possibility at one point that we might pull out of NATO. And very frankly, the entire military structure we've used to contain Russia could fall apart if we did that. They paid no price for annexing Crimea. And obviously, they believe that the president has in many ways given Russia and Putin a pass on Crimea and the Ukraine. They have seen a United States that is slow to enforce sanctions passed by the Congress, by you. And although the president invited Russia back into the G7, the reality is that that invitation contained no concession on the part of the Russians. The U.S. also is set to redeploy 9,500 U.S. forces from Germany, forces that are critical to signaling U.S. resolve with our allies. What are the steps required to counter this Russian threat? Let me end by summarizing them. One, I do believe we have to make clear where the lines are that cannot be crossed. Make very clear that he will not get away with attacks on our forces and that we will respond through diplomatic isolation, through sanctions, and through military force if necessary. We have to recommit to the NATO alliance. Look, Russia and China are our primary adversaries at this point in time. And what is the one thing that they cannot do? They cannot form alliances. They fear alliances. And so our ability to develop and maintain alliances is one of our best weapons against those adversaries. Third, we have to make sure that we do protect free and fair elections in this country, free from Russian interference. And fourthly, we do have to read and listen to intelligence assessments about Russia. This is information that's gathered at great risk. Our intelligence professionals, and you've heard from many of them, have spent their careers analyzing the Russian Federation and Putin. They understand what Putin is up to, and they can be very helpful in providing a heads up to the president and to this country about what Putin is trying to do. Look, no leader can act responsibly for this country without good intelligence. That's a bottom line. Fifthly, I think it's important to suspend the actions to redeploy forces from Europe. This is the wrong time to be moving forces out of Europe. And again, it sends, I believe, a message of weakness to Russia. We have to finally rededicate ourselves to the values that make America strong and free. At the end of the day, what Putin fears the most, very frankly, is our values. They threaten the power he's trying to consolidate: freedom of the press, freedom of speech, equality of all citizens. All of that undermines the strength that he is trying to assert in Russia. The greatest threat to Putin is the values that are our greatest strength in this country. So let me conclude by saying the United States has to be clear with Putin. We cannot afford to send mixed messages to an adversary who wants to make clear. We must make clear that there are lines that we will not allow Russia to cross. One of those lines has to be that we will not tolerate any involvement by Russia in killing U.S. men and women who are putting their lives on the line for this country. Look, as Secretary of Defense and CIA Director, I was involved in deploying our young men and women into harm's way. I had to go to Dover to receive our fallen heroes and give condolences to their families on behalf of a grateful nation. This is about life and death. Life and death. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, I think all of us owe it to our troops and to their families to answer a very simple question. What did our government do to protect our troops? And if Russia did put a price on the heads of our men and women in combat, what price will Russia pay for doing this? Americans are entitled to know that we did everything necessary to protect our troops, our national security, and our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony, comprehensive breadth that you gave to that. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each pursuant to the House rules. All time yield is for the purposes of questioning our witness. Because of the virtual format of the hearing, I'll be recognizing members by committee seniority, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. And if any of you missed your turn, please let your staff know and we'll circle back to you. If you seek recognition, you must unmute your microphone and address the chair verbally. And I'll start this by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to start where you ended your opening remarks. In my life, in my younger years, the most sensitive conversations I had with my father and my grandmother were when they were talking about the circumstances around which my uncle was killed in action. It's left an indelible imprint in my mind and my values. So I agree with you. This is about being responsible and respecting our servicemen and women and families who lost loved ones. And so I just want to underscore your point. Honoring our fallen heroes and their loved ones would mean taking action, creating consequences to hold Putin and the Kremlin accountable, correct? Also, I just want to start with your background in terms of your intelligence background. I'd like to turn next to the intelligence aspect of this. And would it have been plausible in the administrations that you served in for this type of intelligence not to have been briefed to the president? Not just the initial briefing, but briefings before. There were 6 personal calls from March thereafter between the president and Putin. before slashing funds for the European Deterrence Initiative, which was set up to curb Russian aggression, before inviting Russia and Putin to the newly constructed G8, after they were thrown out of Ukraine, thrown out for their aggressive actions in Ukraine and resulted in 13,000 plus Ukraine deaths, and before ordering a quarter of our troops out of Germany. Is it plausible that there would not be a briefing in the administrations you served with in any of those instances?
The role of Commander-in-Chief is to be able to support and defend our men and women in uniform who do put their lives on the line in order to protect our country. And if we received intelligence, frankly, as you've heard, intelligence that is presented as part of the PDB varies in terms of its credibility. And it can be low credibility, it can be moderate, it can be high credibility. But if there is intelligence that indicates that there's a possibility that the Russians were putting a bounty or putting a price on the heads of men and women in uniform, that intelligence would be brought to the attention of the president immediately. Because that does involve the lives of our men and women in uniform. That does involve the responsibility that the president and our military leaders have to be able to protect those that are out there in combat. So I find it very surprising that that kind of information was not brought directly to the President of the United States. I think that the National Security Advisor, I think those who provide the intelligence briefings to the President have an obligation to bring that kind of sensitive intelligence to the attention of the President of the United States.
Well, quickly, Mr. Secretary, if I could, there's been a lot of discussions about the levels of certainty. And again, given your background, would it be something, maybe you can give us shed some light on these things. It wouldn't be random or non-corroborated at all, in your experience, if something was brought to the presidential daily briefing, if it was information that was shared, very high intelligence information, shared with an ally like the UK, and that's been reported in this instance, so they can protect their troops. Or maybe you could tell us about the CIA Wire, the World Intelligence Review, and these are significant benchmarks of intelligence. I'm almost out of time, but if you can just shed some light, because this seems to be the discussion of the week.
Well, again, there's no question that certainly when I was director of the CIA, if we had information that was taking place and it involved our NATO allies, that we would immediately share that with our allies so that they would be aware of it as well, because it involves their lives. And so, first of all, it would be shared with our allies, but most importantly, it is the kind of intelligence that I think it is the duty of those in the White House and in the intelligence community to bring that information to the president, even though they may think it isn't fully corroborated, even though they may think it isn't fully backed up. That doesn't make any difference. That is very sensitive intelligence information that the president of the United States should know and should act upon.
Thank you. That's right on point, and thank you for answering it so directly. I now call on Representative Kinzinger, who can have the additional time that I took if he so desires, and to go over the 5 minutes. Representative Kinzinger.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I think, the question of was the president briefed? I mean, I believe he wasn't. I believe that we can debate, and I think it's probably a good debate within the administration of whether he should have been, because as the secretary mentioned, It's a pretty serious accusation. I'm not sure if the intel was to the point yet of actionable, and so I think decision was made there. One of my concerns about this is Russia and, quite honestly, foreign policy should be a bipartisan issue. And, I think, and it's nobody on this committee, and I mean that, but some people quickly jump to accusations of, the president loves Russia and this kind of stuff. And I think what that does is it makes it more likely that this becomes partisan and that both sides get defensive. But that said, I think we need to get to the bottom of it. And I think it's a very, very serious accusation that we should find out if true. Mr. Secretary, do the Russians want to accelerate the U.S. withdrawal in Afghanistan? Do they want to bog us down in the country for the next decade, or does the outcome not matter for them?
I think the answer is yes. All of the above, because I think their interest is to try to undermine the position of the United States there, and they're going to take advantage of every opportunity. I mean, if they think, and I think this is probably the more likely scenario, if they think that the president is going to be trying to remove our forces from Afghanistan, they're going to try to do everything possible to try to encourage that result, and try to, and I think part of what was involved in this possible intelligence was that they were trying to obviously get Americans killed, have those bodies returned to Dover, and have those families basically saying that enough is enough, and urge the president to bring those troops home. I think that was part of the game here. But in my experience, the Russians were involved in a number of ways with the Taliban and with our enemies, either providing support or providing weapons to try to assist those that were going after American men and women.
So let me ask you two questions, and I think that's the point you make is extremely important. Two specific questions. If this intel is proven correct, and we get whatever high confidence, we find out it's correct, what do you think we should do in response? And then also, if you could piggyback on that, what do you think we should do with regards to the quote unquote peace deal? I disagree with a lot of what the administration is doing on Afghanistan, to be very clear. I think it is a relatively minor investment for, what the alternative would be if we left. But if you could answer those, that'd be great.
Look, I think it's very important that if this information is further corroborated, that the President of the United States has to make very clear, and the President has to do this. The President has to make very clear to Russia and to Putin that we will not tolerate this kind of behavior, and that we are going to take all necessary action to protect and defend our forces. He needs to get that message. We don't have to go into particulars, but I think that larger message needs to be sent, that this is not to be tolerated. With regards to the situation in Afghanistan, I think we've got to be very careful not to make the same mistake we made in Iraq. I was concerned about that because I thought if we withdrew all of our forces there and didn't continue to have a presence in Iraq in trying to work with their security forces, with their intelligence forces to be able to deal with Al-Qaeda and try to make sure that they did not restore any kind of power in Iraq, that what would happen is exactly what did happen, which is the creation of ISIS, and then the invasion, and then the necessity for the United States to go back in and try to defend that. Now, if we just suddenly pull out all of our forces out of Afghanistan and do not have some kind of rational basis on which to maintain a presence to make sure that the Taliban does not take control of that country, and that Al-Qaeda and ISIS don't take control of that country, then I think we're making a big mistake. So it isn't so much whether or not we ought to look at the possibility of withdrawing some of our forces there. The bigger question for me is, are you taking steps to make sure that you are not handing Afghanistan back to those who attacked us on 9/11?
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, a great deal of respect for you. Thank you for being here. The last thing I'll say is, in Afghanistan, the difference between the Russians and us is the Afghan people want us there. It's 80 or 90% agreement. So with that, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
You're muted.
Is Mr. Meeks of New York.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being the great patriot that you are and all that you've done. You've talked and listening to your testimony today, you observed that the administration has been slow to enforce the sanctions against Russia. So now, in light of the credible allegations that the Russian government put bounties on our U.S. armed services in Afghanistan, my question is, can you talk to the effectiveness of the United States' current sanctions regime and all the sanctions that we have in place now, an effective instrument to counter what I call Putinism? That is President Putin's brand of authoritarianism and economic catastrophe. And how would you counter those who say, some say Putin's approval ratings may be on the decline, but sanctions have done little to deter Russians and aggressions worldwide. So what would you say about that and about what we need to do and what kind of sanctions we should put in place?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Look, I would urge the administration to look at their approach to sanctions against Iran and apply those same sanctions, same processes that they've applied there. And they have applied very strong sanctions against Iran in every area. We've gone after their banking capability. We've gone after their ability to sell oil. We have gone after the very heart of their economic ability to stay alive. We've done that. And the argument by the administration is that continuing to press on those sanctions is, in their minds, what will bring Iran ultimately to the table to negotiate. Now, I'm not sure that's going to be the ultimate approach here, but what I'm saying to the administration, I think what should be said to the administration, take the same approach that you're using against one adversary, Iran, and apply exactly the same kind of pressures with regards to Russia. Because if we did, mark my words, it would send a clear signal to Putin that we are serious about making sure that they stop the aggression that they've been involved with.
Greg, I think you're muted again, Mr. Meeks. I think you're muted.
I think, thank you for that. I think that gives us more work that we could do in Congress as far as passing those similar type sanctions that you just indicated that we have on Iran, on Russia, and see what the president does with that. Because, as I said yesterday's hearing, for his silence, not even saying that he's going to go after and check out everything, that if there's anything that's possible to be found, he's going to go after them. We haven't heard that. We haven't heard anything from the administration, and silence, in my viewpoint, is complicity to a large degree. And when it comes to our men and women who are putting their lives on the line, we've got to stand up for them in that regards. And you also testified a lot in my last few minutes about the strong support and the need for us to make sure that NATO and our Transatlantic Economic Relations Subcommittee, of which I am the co-chair of the NATO PA. We've had this conversation going back and forth. And I make the case that a strong NATO is beneficial to the United States and our transatlantic relations, just as you have. So you explained to a large degree why the U.S. support for the Euro-Atlantic security institutions like NATO serve as the bulkhead against Russian aggression, and that we don't need to withdraw our troops from Germany. So can you better say how we should send that message to the American people so that they know that we need to make this stronger case about how important NATO is to us and our national security interests?
Well, I am a strong believer in the importance of our NATO relationship. As both director of the CIA and also as Secretary of Defense, I can't tell you how important it was to be able to work with our allies, not only in sharing intelligence, but in doing security work together, and in taking steps to be able to protect the security of Europe and of the United States. I mean, we could not have done that without NATO. This goes back to what Harry Truman did, for God's sakes, in establishing not only NATO, but the Marshall Plan and the other steps that were taken in order to contain Russia. And they've been successful. I think in some measure, were responsible for bringing down the Berlin Wall. So I'm a big believer that we need to maintain our NATO alliance and to maintain our presence there. I think the president ought to do two things. Number one, make clear to Russia that we will not tolerate the Russians doing anything to target our men and women in uniform. Two, that we are going to maintain our force strength in Germany and elsewhere as part of our NATO commitment to ensure that Russia will not take any steps of aggression against other former Soviet states. And thirdly, I think diplomatically strengthening those sanctions you talked about should be part of the package so that Putin gets a clear message that we are not going to tolerate his behavior. That message of strength will take us a long way towards making clear that Putin is going to pay a price for behaving the way he does. And right now, that message isn't there.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Representative Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling such an amazing and highly respected witness. And Mr. Secretary, I always say this when I talk to you. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree with your son, the finest man I know. And thank you for being you. Thank you for always putting your country ahead of your party. Because of that, you have more respect than you realize across the political spectrum, including from every Republican that I know. And I wish we could clone and replicate you, sir. So I just wanted to say that at the outset. Two things, and I had to jump off, so I don't know if this question was asked before. Number one, with regard to, because, you know, your role as director of the CIA, if you could just help me and the panel, you know, and my colleagues to understand how the presidential daily briefing works as far as inclusion, exclusion, what gets orally briefed versus what doesn't, and to what extent, you know, different people should be held responsible regarding omissions. And my second question is with regard to Vladimir Putin, who you probably understand better than any of us. What do you believe his ultimate goals are? And what do you believe his greatest fear is? Because it's always helpful to know what these people fear. What do you think he fears?
Okay, thank you for that question. You've had some testimony to this effect, but you know, basically, what we do with the presidential daily brief is to summarize all of the intelligence that has come in during that evening that involves threats to the United States. I mean, it can contain other information, but it's largely dealing with threats that are out there. And you know, there's a lot of work done to scrub the information that comes in. There's a great deal of information that comes in from all of our sources around the world. And so there's a process of trying to scrub down what is the key intelligence that we are receiving and that the president should be informed of. That is contained then in the PDB. For those of you that have not seen a PDB, it can be a number of pages, depending on the intelligence that has come across. Look, it's not, you know, I understand the president's reluctance to look at some of that stuff. I have to tell you, it's not a very comforting read when you look at the PDB, because you're reading about all the threats that are possible against the United States. And it could start your day off on the wrong foot by virtue of that. But nevertheless, it's important information that the president needs to have and that other policymakers need to have. And so when it's presented to the president in the briefings, I mean, don't forget, this PDB is circulated not just to the president, it's circulated to other key individuals in the administration, National Security Advisor, to the Chief of Staff, to the key cabinet members, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, so that all of them are briefed. I mean, normally a briefer is assigned to all of those key people. And the briefer will go through the PDB. I mean, your first responsibility is to read the PDB. And it is, as I said, it's a lengthy read. So it's important to have a good briefer. The briefer will sit down and go through the key elements of the briefing and highlight key information, respond to your question. That's usually what's done, and I'm sure it's done with the president and with these other individuals. So in some ways, even though the briefer may not have touched on everything, it is the responsibility of the person who gets the PDB to read the damn thing. And as I said, I know it's tough. I know it can be time consuming, but there's a lot of important information there. So I'm a little concerned that other people who, if this was in fact contained in the PDB, why others didn't raise this as well as a result of it. It's not just up to the briefer, it's also up to the individual who has to read the PDB. With regards to Putin, I don't think there's any question, as I mentioned, and I think Bob Gates got it right. This guy is a KGB officer. He thinks like a KGB officer. He's immersed in all of the the tactics and the methods of spies. That's what he cares about. I mean, I'll tell you just quickly one instance. When we were dealing with 10 Russian agents who had been planted here in the United States, and we were able to discover that they were there. We arrested them and we tried to work out, and we did work out a trade with Russia. At the time, I talked to my Russian counterpart with the intelligence there, and I said, will you agree to this trade? And he said at that time, and Putin wasn't even president, he said, we have to talk to Putin about whether or not we can make this trade. So Putin had his hands on all of that in the intelligence intrigue that goes on. His goals are to really restore the former Soviet Union. He thinks that that was a great tragedy, that they were weakened, and I think his goal is to gradually do what he did in Crimea with regards to other countries that were former members of the Soviet state. His greatest fear is that if the United States remains strong and remains true to our values, that ultimately, if we can work with our allies, that we can weaken Russia and bring them down the same way that the former Soviet Union went down. That's what he fears. And that's why his primary goal is to undermine our strength and undermine our values.
Very helpful for that perspective, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. David Cicilline from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing. Mr. Panetta, Mr. Secretary, just to let you know, the admiration of your son is bipartisan. So we all feel tremendous honor to serve with him. And
Thank you.
thank you for your extraordinary service to our country. As you said, we have no more sacred responsibility than to honor the lives lost in defense of our country. And sharing words of appreciation is not sufficient. We must act consistent with that obligation. And our most basic response has to be to condemn this action, punish it, and deter it from ever happening again. And of course, the president has to understand that his responsibility as commander-in-chief to support and defend our men and women in uniform goes beyond trying to plan a military parade, but actually is fundamentally his most important responsibility. And when the briefing was provided to the senior members of our caucus at the White House, Mr. Hoyer came out of that briefing and said, nothing in this briefing that we have just received led me to believe it's a hoax, which is what the president claimed. And Mr. Engel, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, said the American people deserve to know why the president didn't condemn Vladimir Putin. For God's sakes, these are our soldiers. And if we're not going to protect them, what are we going to do? And so my question is, National Security Advisor Mr. O'Brien began to prepare options for the president to consider in response to this intelligence. And so my first question is it the normal case that there has to be some level of intelligence before the difficult process of developing a set of options to respond occurs? And secondly, in order to be included in the presidential daily brief, there has to be some intelligence to support it, whether it's moderate, high, or low confidence. But the presidential daily brief doesn't include rumors or innuendos or unsupported allegations. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. The intelligence that is there ranges across a vast spectrum of credibility. But, let me just give you an example. If there were intelligence there that a nuclear weapon had been planted someplace in Washington, D.C., and let's assume that, there just wasn't a lot of credibility assigned to that. But just the mere fact that there may be a nuclear weapon in Washington, D.C. is significant enough that you better damn well alert the President of the United States to that possibility.
Yeah. And I think the challenge and the question that I have, Mr. Secretary, is sort of the elephant in the room. You've spoken a lot about strong condemnation, about not moving troops out of Europe, a number of steps, working more closely with our allies. But these are suggestions being made in the context of a president who, from the day he took office, has expressed admiration for Vladimir Putin, has described Russian interference in our presidential campaign as a hoax, stood at Helsinki and sided with Vladimir Putin against the U.S. intelligence community. And so my question was two-part is, what can we do in that context where the president of the United States refuses to do all the things you described? Can Congress substitute in a meaningful way? And the second part of that question is, what damage does it do? And what does Vladimir Putin think when he hears the president say those things and behave that way in terms of future aggression?
Well, as all of you know, the members of Congress, obviously you can play a very important role in terms of oversight. You can play a very important role in terms of trying to move legislation that will send a message. You can play a very important role in terms of what you do to educate your constituencies about these issues. But in the end, it is the President of the United States who is Commander-in-Chief and who has the power to be able to speak on behalf of the United States to our foreign adversaries. I find it very difficult. And, as a former chief of staff, having worked with national security advisors, that they would not, when this issue came up, make very clear that the president needs to speak to this issue to Putin and to the country about this possibility. And they can, they could have made references to the questions they have about the credibility of the intelligence. But the fact is that that intelligence is so critical because it does involve the lives of our men and women in uniform. I mean, look, Secretary of Defense, and I'm sure many of you have gone abroad, and you look into the eyes of our men and women in uniform, and these are brave young people who are willing to fight and die for this country. I mean, I talk about getting a sense of confidence about what the strength of America is. Look into the eyes of our men and women in uniform and what they're willing to do. And if you do that, then we owe them every step necessary to help protect their lives. And so when you get this kind of information, I think the National Security Advisor, I think the Chief of Staff, I think the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State should have gone immediately to the President of the United States and said, you need to issue a statement that makes clear to Russia that this should not happen. I mean, rather than having the president say, well, I never saw it, or nobody ever told me, and having the National Security Advisor say, well, it just wasn't the right kind of intelligence to present to the president. I mean, push all of that aside. The fundamental issue is, are you going to protect our forces? Are you going to protect our men and women in uniform? That's what they should have focused on, and that should have been the main message coming out of the White House.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, very much. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Tim Burchett from Tennessee.
Right on. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes,
Loud and clear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for putting together this important meeting. Secretary, I could lay on all the accolades, but I think the best thing you ever did was make a really cool son. I dig him. He's a good dude, man, and he's a good friend, as I told you earlier. But anyway, that's what we do here in the South. We say something nice for you, then we go for the juggler. I'm just,
with all due respect.
Yeah, with all due respect, and I'm putting you on my prayer list, or that's the way we gossip too. In church we say, "Oh, we need to pray for old so and so. I think he's hitting the bottle a little too much, or whatever." But anyway, hey, all kidding aside, I had a question. It's changing lanes just a little bit. It's well documented though with the Russians, and for the record, I don't like Putin. I think he's a thug. We try to be diplomats. And I know that probably he hears that Tim Burchett thinks he's a thug. I know he probably quakes in his Gucci loafers because the 435th most powerful man in Congress is calling him out. But I don't like the guy. I don't care. But I know it's well documented the Russians operate a spy ship called the Yantar. And the ship carries submersibles that can tap into and even sever our undersea fiber optic cables, which would slow our communication with our allies considerably. Additionally, the Russian subs are known to operate close to these cables. I was wondering if you could discuss the Russian submarine fleet and specifically the threat that it poses to our undersea cable network and what we can do to protect the flow of data.
Well, it's a very good point for you to look at, because make no mistake about it, the Russians are engaged in whatever efforts they can engage in order to try to either take our technology or interfere with our communication, or obviously interfere with our election process. That's what the Russians are all about.
Right.
And they do it obviously through their intelligence forces and their spies, but they also use their military for that purpose as well. A lot of what you're asking, wanders into classified territory, so I'm a little hesitant to go
I understand that.
into specific operations. But Make no mistake about it. The Russians are trying to conduct efforts that interfere with the communications that go on between the United States and the rest of the world. And they have very sophisticated equipment to be able to accomplish that. That I think should be of concern, not just to you, but to all Americans.
Do you think they'd rather sever those cables, or would they just tap into them and find out all of our secrets, I guess?
I think the more important effort for them is to tap in and get that information.
Okay. Well, what is the why do you think they rely so much on techniques like information warfare and the covert special operations and cyber attacks to confront the West? Is it because they're so effective, or is it just all they have?
No, it's something we better get smart about, because that could very well be the kind of conflict we're going to have to face in the future. I mean, I know we focus on conventional wars. I know we focus on potential nuclear wars, but the Russians have developed a hybrid capability that I think is going to become the weapon of the future. It combines cyber with the ability to conduct covert operations, with the ability to have even the military involved to assist others, but it's all done on a covert basis. And it works very effectively. They've used it in the Ukraine, they've used it in Syria, they've used it elsewhere. We need to develop that kind of hybrid capability. It's not to say that we don't have some of those same elements. Obviously, we have special forces, we have other technologies that are able to give us some capability. But I think the ability to put together an entire strategy as they have done, using hybrid methods of warfare, has proven very effective in their ability to produce chaos, to undermine stability, and to create the kind of situation that they can then take an advantage of. So in many ways, hybrid warfare for the Russians is an arm of their diplomacy, so that they can then go in and undermine the strength of whatever country they're dealing with. That's how they operate.
All right. Hey, thank you. I'm out of time, but I just want to tell you what an honor it is. And I wish my folks were alive. They probably wouldn't agree much on your politics, but they would dig the results that you get. So I wish they were alive to see this. This is really cool. Thank you, brother. Say hey to Jimmy tonight.
Thank you very much. I'll say hi for you.
Yes, sir, brother. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll tell my wife in Kentucky that she can talk Southern to me tonight. And I'm already prepared for it.
Well, the South's the only place in the country where people don't speak with an accent. You know that, don't you?
I'm told we have some here in Massachusetts too.
If you get pulled over in Tennessee, just say y'all and say, where can I get a moon pie? And then they'll probably still throw you in the back of the squad car. So anyway.
Or key lime pie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Or key lime pie. Let's get serious here and recognize Mr. Costa from California. I think you're muted, Jim.
Now, does this work? I want to thank the chairman of the subcommittee for this important hearing, and I think we're all honored on a bipartisan basis to have Secretary Panetta testify before us. His wealth of knowledge, experience, and expertise has obviously been well stated and documented. And Leon, it's an honor to have been your friend and worked with you for over 30 years. And for all my other colleagues who are giving you all the credit for Jimmy, I will tell them that the Panetta household, there's always been a partnership with Sylvia. And it's been a team sport in terms of service to our nation and public policy. And so we know that Jimmy not only derives that from you, but from his mom as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, give her my regards. I want to take off on that. First of all, in your summary, you really talked about what constituted was a plan that we used during the Cold War on a bipartisan basis to confront the Soviet Union. And that plan, regardless from administration to administration, in terms of the foundations of that plan, was very successful because it had continuity and it had bipartisan support, and it also from administration to administration as well as the Congress, where politics in those days, when you served, tended to stop at the water's edge. Not so much these days, unfortunately. So I guess my question to you is how would you suggest that we reinstitute a bipartisan plan in place? I think you talked about what the tenets of that plan could constitute. I think in doing, we also, you just noted by my last colleague who talked about the hybrid implementation that Putin has implemented to undermine the West, us and our allies in Europe. And you got to give him credit. He's taken a limited hand and he's played it very well. So I'm wondering, because I agree with you, I think the conventional weapons, because for a lot of reasons, as we go forward, are going to have less of an impact as our ability to deal with these hybrid efforts that involve high tech and a lot of other things. I think we got repair work that we need to do on NATO, and I think that Keating and I, we both are active in the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue. I'd like to get your sense on how much repair work you think we need to do. You know, people forget that the 71 years of NATO is the longest peacetime period in Europe in over 1,000 years. And we helped happen with President Truman, as you noted, not just because we're good people, but that was in our own interest. And it still is in our own. And it's critical that we educate. And finally, when we talk about an overall strategy, I sometimes, and this is no reference to any sort of ethnic community in our country, but I think Putin and company are kind of the Russian version of the Sopranos. And that, I mean, you know, we look at the 50 top pals of his and how they've taken so much of Russia's wealth and how much of that is in European banks and other places. And I've seen their yachts in the Caribbean and in the Mediterranean and the lifestyle they live. We know where a lot of those bank accounts are. And I'm wondering if that could be a part of a hybrid strategy to grab them where it hurts.
Good question, Jim. Let me try to do my best to try to mention what I think are the important areas that we need to stress. Look, first and foremost, obviously, we do have to maintain our military power. We have to be the strongest military power on the face of the earth. That's critical. And it sends a very important message that the United States has the ability to respond to any threat, not only diplomatically, but militarily if necessary. So maintaining a strong military, developing obviously a hybrid capability, I think is important as well. Secondly, I am a believer, as I stated, in alliances and the importance of alliances. I think developing alliances is the key to our ability to respond to a number of flashpoints in the world. I think we're dealing with a lot of flashpoints right now. It's not just Russia. We're dealing with failed states in the Middle East. We're dealing with Syria. We're dealing with Iran. We're dealing with North Korea. We're dealing with Russia. We're dealing with China. We're dealing with cyber attacks, all of which are threatening our national security. I think one of the keys to be able to respond to that many threats, first of all, is to have the United States be a world leader. I don't think we should withdraw from leadership in the world. I think we have to be a world leader. And as a world leader, I think we ought to be not only strengthening the NATO alliance, which is our primary alliance in dealing with Russia, but I also think we ought to be building new alliances in Southeast Asia, we ought to be building an alliance with those countries to try to check China. I think there is that possibility. If we work with those countries, when I was Secretary of Defense, I was trying to build that kind of relationship on a security basis so that we were working together on security areas. I think we could build an alliance in the Middle East made up of moderate Arab countries, made up of Israel, to try to deal with the threat from Iran, try to deal with the threat from terrorism. I think we can build an alliance in South America, in Africa. I mean, alliances are going to be the key to our ability to preserve peace and prosperity in the future. So I would stress that. Thirdly, diplomacy. I think it's really critical that we have a strong diplomatic arm available and that we have good diplomats in these areas who represent the United States and who keep their ear to the ground and can tell us what kind of threats that are out there. And I also believe very deeply in a strong intelligence capability. We just can't do this unless we have information about what the hell our adversaries are up to. We can't operate in the dark. No leader can operate in the dark. So getting that kind of intelligence is a good thing, not a bad thing. It's a good thing to be able to have our spies and our sources and our capabilities out there trying to gather information on where these threats are and providing that to our opinion makers. But lastly, something that you mentioned that I think is really important is somehow we have got to restore a sense of bipartisanship when it comes to our national security interests. During most of my career in the Congress, even when I was Secretary of Defense, I really worked to get bipartisan support with regards to what I was doing. And I did get bipartisan support, and it was very important. I think somehow we've got to get back to that spirit of bipartisanship. I mean, I know the politics of today, and I know what all of you are putting up with one way or the other. But at some point, we really have to be concerned about this country. And right now, I think Putin looks at the United States and looks at the polarization and the partisanship and the divide that has taken place in our country and sees that as weakness on the part of the United States. When we are together, when we're working together, there is no country stronger than the United States of America. So I hope at some point we can get back to a spirit of true bipartisanship when it comes to national security issues.
Well, thank you. Time's expired, but I think your point is well taken. I mean, he's exploited Western elections, been doing it in Europe longer than he's been doing it in the United States, all with the intention to take our divisions and to undermine our strength of governing. And that's the limited hand that I think he's played pretty well so. But no, Mr. Chairman, my time's expired, but on those three categories, diplomacy, our NATO alliance, are we stronger or weaker than we were 3 years ago, 4 years ago?
Well, I worry that that we've sent a signal. I mean, when I've gone abroad, our NATO allies are very concerned about the commitment of the United States towards the NATO alliance, and that's not a good thing. So it really is important, and I commend the Congress because I think the Congress has spoken pretty clearly about the importance of protecting NATO. I think it's important for the President of the United States to speak to that importance as much as possible so that our NATO allies know that the United States is going to be a partner and will be there if something should happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our members for being so patient. And if you had to be patient and you had to be somewhere in the country to be patient, I would probably rather be in San Diego than many other places. The chair would like to recognize Representative Juan Vargas from San Diego.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Loud and clear.
I want to thank you for holding this hearing, and the ranking member. I appreciate it very much, and especially Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I do think that I would be remiss, as my colleagues have already said, if I didn't tell you about my affection towards your son, Jimmy. We all like him very much. He's a wonderful member and a good friend to all of us. You do have a very unique perspective, and obviously it's come out in this hearing because you were the Secretary of Defense, you were the Director of the CIA, and you were the White House Chief of Staff. So I thank you for your words and your perspective. And unfortunately, I think you're correct that we are in a new Cold War, which I think is sad and too bad. I think a lot of us believed or wanted to believe that when the Iron Curtain came down, that we were going to be able to work with Russia. Russia does have a lot of Western thought in it. A lot of the books that we love, that we read in college, or Dostoevsky, these come Tolstoy, they are written by Russians. So a lot of us were hopeful, and unfortunately that hope turned to despair, I think, when they went the hard line, especially with Putin. Now, I have to say that I agree with everything that you've said about the asymmetric deals that this Putin has put on, but this feels different. Putting a bounty on U.S. soldiers to kill them, to me, feels different. When I read about this and I heard about it, it was, I think, different, almost a red on blue attack. Could you comment about that? Because this, to me, doesn't feel the same as what they've been doing previously.
In some ways, it's difficult to believe that an adversary would put bounties out there in order to kill U.S. Men and women in combat. And it strikes me as Putin taking a very careless step. I mean, I think it's careless to think that, assuming that this is true, and as I said, it sounds like something that might come out of his playbook. But I think it's an indication that Putin feels empowered to do things that he would not otherwise do. And because he doesn't pay a price, because we're not taking steps to make clear to him that that this will not be tolerated. I think what it does is it gives him a sense that, yeah, we can try to do something that we may not have done before, but if it's successful and if U.S. men and women are killed as a result of this, and if the United States is so depressed by our presence in Afghanistan that we remove our forces from Afghanistan, then it could play to his benefit. And I think that's the way he thinks. He doesn't think as a world leader. He really thinks as a former spy.
Yeah.
And that's I think, what led to this.
In many senses, it does not only seem careless, but reckless, too. I mean, incredibly reckless. Now, assuming for a second that it is true that the intelligence comes back and says that this is what they were attempting to do, and in fact, let's even say that they were successful. God forbid they were, but let's say that they were. I know one of the things that we've looked at previously, and we haven't done, is kicked Russia out of SWIFT, out of the banking system that we have that secures these transactions. We've always thought that he would act recklessly, and Medvedev and others have said, you better not do that. What do you think would happen if we did take a pretty dramatic step to kick them out? I mean, you took the look at Iran. That is what we did to Iran, obviously. What would happen? How would he react?
Well, it's that old story about the jackass that wouldn't move, and the guy finally hit the jackass across the head with the stick, and somebody said, "What the hell are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm trying to get its attention." I think we may have to do something bold in order to get Putin's attention right now, because I think right now Putin does not really believe that the United States is going to respond in a way that is going to really undermine, Russia. and undermine him. So I think it may be necessary to send a bold signal to Russia that he has crossed the line. I think when you take steps to put a price on the heads of our men and women in uniform, that is crossing a line that is unacceptable.
Yeah.
And I think we do need to send Russia a very clear signal that that is not to be tolerated.
Well, thank you again. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Maybe we need that 2x4 then to teach Russia what to do. Thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
The chair recognizes Mr. Sherman from California.
Mr. Secretary, thanks for your service. Thanks for donating your son to our institution. The loudest testimony on this we heard yesterday from Secretary Mayo, whose decision not to come before the full committee speaks volumes about how the policy-making process in the White House and the policies they actually derive there are simply indefensible, cannot be defended. Russia and the United States have a long history of arming each other's enemies. Thousands of our troops died in Vietnam at the hands of Soviet weapons. Thousands of Russians died in Afghanistan, in part because we marked the Mujahideen. But that's at a time when the Soviet Union and the United States were enemies and treated each other as enemies. For several years, Russia is known to have been providing weapons to the Taliban. And while occasionally the Taliban strike ISIS, for the most part, those weapons are used to kill Americans. But now they've added this additional obscenity of putting a bounty on the head of American soldiers. And so they're acting like an enemy, and they've learned that they can act like an enemy, and we treat them like a friend. The president bestows great honor and friendship. Then he brings up the G8. We still allow our financial institutions to lend money to the Soviet, to the Russian state. And we had a law requiring that sanctions be imposed on the sovereign debt issue, and the Treasury imposed the lightest possible version of these that still allow for Americans to invest in Russian sovereign debt and American banks to lend money to Russian state enterprises. Of course, those sanctions were in response to their violation of the chemical weapons. One of those. Russia so many wrongs. Not one thing they killed one of their dissidents in Britain using chemical weapons. And of course, there's a pipeline being built that will make Germany dependent upon Russian natural gas. We have limited resources and many flashpoints in the world. Russia's our only problem. We can have primary sanctions where we take action ourselves, and secondary sanctions where we try to force our allies to do something that is tougher than they want to do. We can have economic action. We can sell weapons or provide weapons to Russia's enemies. We can do troop deployment. Looking at this whole panoply, we should at least make it clear that they should not be allowed in the G8, and that American financial institutions shouldn't be lending money to the Russian state or its state-owned enterprises. Would that be a starting place?
Yeah, you've outlined the options that are available very well. And I don't think there's any question that any one of those options, whether it was to take away that invitation to the G7, G8, or whether it's to tighten up the sanctions in a way that really would have an impact in terms of Russia. I think doing that would send a message that the United States is not going to simply look in the other direction while the Russians do what they're doing. That signal needs to be sent.
I'll point out that the tough sanctions on Russian sovereign debt are thought to increase their borrowing costs by about half a percentage point, which in the financial world is very solid. And that we in the House passed my amendment that would accomplish that. It was taken out in the Senate. We'll have a chance to do that again with the NDAA bill. Mr. Secretary, should we also be providing more weapons than we have to Ukraine and to Georgia?
Obviously, I think our ability to provide military aid to the Ukraine is extremely important in sending that signal to Russia that we are not going to allow the Ukraine to be taken over by Russia. And I don't think there's any question that we ought to be looking at what additional military aid could we provide that would assist the Ukrainian forces in their effort to try to maintain their independence.
Thank you, and I thank the chair for letting me participate, even though I'm.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. I ask the ranking member if he has any closing statements. Otherwise, I'll have a few closing remarks, thanking the members that participated and you, Mr. Secretary. There was talk about bipartisanship. You can see through this committee, there's collegiality, civility. We don't agree on everything, but you can see, I think, in the American public can see members of Congress do work together, and we do understand the importance of that. I do want to just have a couple of closing remarks. Despite that collegiality, this is as serious as it gets as an issue. This has been, to me, and I think most members, just a heartbreaking and anxious time with the information that bounties could have actually been placed on our military's head. But what we're suffering through is nothing compared to what our troops that are serving and the family members of the troops who are lost have been going through. And I just want to emphasize our hearts and our conviction. We're with them, and this isn't going to go away. So many issues go away. This issue is going to be like the coronavirus. This is not going away. I'll tell you that. As members of Congress, this won't be the news of the day until we get answers, and we'll continue to do that. There's one thing they should know too, at least in my view, the perception that somehow something came across the president's desk and he missed it. Just doesn't cut it with me. I mean, just in the period between that briefing and the end of February that was on his desk and what transpired the same, that's one swing and miss. There was 6 calls in preparation, person to person, between our president and Putin. 6. 7th thing, before the G7 discussions and the invitation, there was another period where you had to sit down and say, hey, this is going on before you give that invitation, before you do something like cut the European deterrence funding, which is one of the most popular programs that deters Russia and brings our allies together. Before we went to informing the British that this was a threat to them. Are we to believe that our intelligence reached out to the British and said, by the way, this is a serious threat, we want you to know, and they never did that to the president? They had to have done it before they pulled out a quarter of a troop, before he wanted to pull out a quarter of our troops in Germany. He knew the impact of that and what it meant. And it had to have occurred before or after his top security officials all gathered together, which we know now, in a meeting in March, and planned options to react to this. Those are 11 things off the top of my head. That's not one swing and miss. Those are 11 facts, and that's just, I'm sure, a partial list. The other thing that's come clear from this hearing and the ones that preceded it, we should have great confidence in. We absolutely, and there's no doubt in my mind, have the ability to do things to counter this. and counter it effectively. It's not a question of being able to do it. It's a question of doing it. And I'm quite optimistic that a whole array of options, many of them, Mr. Secretary, that you brought up today that are so important, can be done, and they will be effective. And the last point is, we have to do it. We have to act now, because as we're discussing this, even with the best of our oversight, the Russians are still, as we speak, attacking and preparing to attack further our electoral process in this next election. That's a given. Our own intelligence is clear and consistent with that. And we have to understand that they'll be emboldened by this and further endanger our safety and the safety of our allies and the safety of our troops. We can't wait. So there's an urgency. We will continue to do our best. Your presence here today with us helps a great deal. We hope to continue to work with you and get your advice, your counsel, and because it's so important, and to move ahead. The people of the United States, people that serve us, their families deserve nothing less. So with that, I adjourn and thank everyone for being here. By the way, if I could, as I mentioned at the beginning, there'll be 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material and questions, subject to the rules of this committee. I repeat that as well. It just have to be done by email. With that, I adjourn.